Hello Internet, my name is the Golden Stalfos, and today's video is going to be a bit of a doozy. So the purpose of today's video is not really to talk about the current One Piece story or the future of that story, so much as it is to talk about Yamato and the particular things that Yamato represents in storytelling and manga in general. So I don't really think a spoiler warning is necessary, but also I'm not even entirely sure if Yamato's been introduced in the anime, so like, spoilers for One Piece, I guess. And maybe some other stuff, I don't know. This discussion will almost certainly end up touching on characters like Kaluto from Hunter x Hunter, and maybe even some more obscure stuff like Angel Sanctuary. Touches on trans issues a surprising amount considering when it was written and what it's written about. But I also might not talk about that too much because it's very niche and very weird. But anyway, that's spoiler warning, I guess. If you're not caught up with the history of trans representation in anime, then like, that's what this video is about, so sorry. That said, I want to spend some time establishing context, because the main bulk of this discussion is whether or not Yamato represents a change for the industry, or at the very least a change for One Piece in terms of trans representation. And in order to discuss that, I need to establish what the current trend is and what it probably should be. So let's go. Now, the first thing to understand with anime and manga is that Japan has a much more conservative and much less concerned with unique groups mentality compared to countries like America. The simple fact is that Japan is a country that's very much built on traditional values and families and work ethic, and like, there's not a whole lot of room in their society for civil rights stuff. That said, they're not the most extreme when it comes to this kind of thing. You know, there are lots of countries in the world that have laws that limit people's ability to exist as they want to and stuff like that. And I haven't heard anything like that in Japan, but it's certainly not like the norm or even really acknowledged by most people there. However, issues like this often pop up in anime and manga because they're niche, and therefore nerds and losers and people on the fringes of society, and they're often made by those people to a certain extent. And also, the artistic nature of the medium means that you can represent things and ideas that are hard to represent in more traditional ways, and that might not be looked on as favorably in more traditional media because, you know, it's a fantasy. So things like trans representation are more likely to show up in manga than they are in traditional literature or, you know, major motion pictures or whatever. And to be fair, this is far from capturing the nuances of Japanese society and how it views these issues, because there's a lot of historical context to these kinds of things. Japan, like a lot of countries, has had weird traditions with theater and who can be in theater and what kind of roles can be played in theater, especially because theater is a fringe thing that exists on the outside. There's more awareness or representation or interaction with the LGBTQ community in that area than there is in other areas, and like a whole bunch of things, nuances that I can't really talk about. But in any case, within the scope of anime and manga, there's always been some small amount of exploring the fringes of society and talking about quote-unquote alternative lifestyles and so forth. Every once in a while, a really popular show will have like a gay character or a trans character or whatever. But the way they're talked about and the way they're included into the stories is different across time and across authors, obviously, but also with cultural perception. You know, in the 80s, it was kind of a big deal that Sailor Moon had a lesbian couple. But over the years, that's been normalized to a certain extent in these media, and now there's an entire genre for lesbian couples. It's pretty good. And there's actually some really great stories in that genre, some really great romances and slice of life shows and like exploration, you know, coming of age stories. I mean, there are also really poorly written ones, and, there are always things that fall into bad writing habits, whatever genre. But still, there are some really good stories in there. And over the last few years especially, there have been way more manga and anime that are willing to embrace gay characters or even base their stories around them. However, trans characters haven't gotten that same treatment. They've always been kind of in a weird spot. And quite frankly, I think One Piece has been one of the biggest reasons why that has been a problem. One Piece doesn't have a lot of big flaws that people can point to and complain about, but its representation of trans characters has always been one. To put it shortly, in One Piece there's a group of people called Newkama, which I think is actually just a Japanese term that translates to crossdresser, but I'm not like 100% on that. And these people occasionally show up to be basically the butt of a joke. And I'm not entirely sure if it's fair to put those people in a discussion about trans characters, because there is a meaningful distinction between cross-dressers and trans people, but also authors don't always actually make that distinction, and it's very possible and honestly likely that in Oda's mind they were considered the same things when he was writing these characters. So the thing is, the Newkama characters in One Piece have always been the same character, right? It's a big hairy guy in lingerie. And the butt of the joke is normally, ooh, look how hideous these people are, which isn't cool, like at all. For example, Sanji, who is a character with his own set of issues, basically he's one of the perverted characters. And personally, I have a lot of issues with anime's need for a perverted character as a joke, because that's not a joke, but video for another time. For now, we just have to accept that there are perverted characters, because somehow the fact that someone is interested in sex is a joke, even if there's nothing else added onto it, no punchline, no setup, no nothing. It's just, hey, haha, sex, haha. I don't get it, but whatever. But anyway, because Sanji is that character, he ends up spending his 2-year time skip on an island full of the Newkama people, and, that means there's no women, just male crossdressers. And he spends his entire time running from them, and that's his training, which is so fucked up. Like, they do it for a joke, but it's so fucked up. And then, right after the time skip ends, right, they go to, and this is even more stupid, but they go to Fishman Island, which has, mermaids and stuff, and Sanji's always wanted to ogle mermaids because, of course. And so he has a nosebleed because that's how anime works, but they actually turn it into a plot point, and he has to get a blood transfusion and shit, and of course the only people there who are willing to give him a blood transfusion are the Newkama people, so they make another joke out of it. It's awful. It's awful. Now granted, that plotline leads into some really serious and meaningful stuff about racism and the value of blood ties, and it's a whole thing, but in order to get there, Oda has to trample over these other characters in a way that's just awful. Now, this isn't to say that Oda has never shown some nuance with these characters before, because the named characters who fall into this category do get some personalization of some sort. The first example is Bon Clay, who is introduced as sort of a shape-shifting ballerina crazy person. He's obsessed with swans and speaks in French and has all kinds of weird eccentricities, whatever. And he's also Sanji's rival on Alabasta. And I'm saying he because that's what they do in the manga. Bon Clay is never really portrayed as being truly trans, I don't think. So much as he's a guy who likes to dress up like a ballerina, I guess. And again, there should be nuance there, but because of who's writing it and how it's being displayed to us, I'm not sure that there is nuance there. For example, everyone else in the organization Bon Clay works with is paired up in groups of 2, one guy, one girl. But Bon Clay works on his own, presumably because Oda thought that if Bon Clay had a female or male partner, then that would clearly say that Bon Clay is male or female, but like, he's supposed to be both, I guess. And not that this is supposed to represent gender fluid people in a particular, maybe it is, but again, it's not made clear that that's the case. And it seems much more likely that Oda was trying to say that Bon Clay is weird and different and shouldn't be seen the way everyone else is seen, which is hard and honestly a little bit cruel. However, despite the weirdness with how Bon Clay is displayed, he does represent a largely positive role in the story and gets a decent amount of spotlight. In fact, without him, on at least 2 occasions, the Straw Hat crew would have been doomed. And while Bon Clay's position in the story overall has been largely positive, the way Oda treats him still mostly isn't. It still feels like the reason Bon Clay exists, even when he's doing something cool, is to be a joke. Like, haha, look at how crazy and weird this character is. And, you know, for a guy whose belt turns into a gorilla, that's kind of cool. But for a trans person, that's... And quite frankly, when the punchline is, haha, this character exists, haha, one, it's really annoying when that happens and it's a recurring character, like Buggy. And 2, when that happens, it creates this looking down on effect, right? Like when the joke is that someone exists, that's like inherently derogatory to that entire category of people and like not okay. And that kind of mentality has expanded to every trans character in the series, with the exception of maybe 1. Alright, so in the Impel Down arc, we are introduced to Ivankov, who is like the leader of the Newkama people and their role model, icon, whatever. But Ivankov actually has more nuance than Bon Clay. Right, while Bon Clay will have weird speeches where he talks about not being either a man or a woman, everyone in the manga refers to him as a he, including himself, so it's kind of weird that he has those speeches. However, with Ivankov, it's actually not clear whether Ivankov was supposed to be originally a male or female, and good. It doesn't matter. But the interesting thing about Ivankov, for a number of reasons, is that they have a fruit which gives them the superpowers to inject hormones. It's complicated, but basically, Ivankov has the power to transform themselves from male to female basically at will, and there don't really seem to be any side effects. Despite this, Ivankov mostly presents as a big, hairy, ugly guy in lingerie because that's what Oda thinks is funny. Ivankov also is noted for having an extremely eccentric personality. Not that this is particularly rare amongst One Piece characters, but it comes off as playing into a stereotype, I guess. Not that real-life drag queens can't be eccentric, just that, like, it's maybe a harmful stereotype. And I say drag queen rather than trans people in that sentence because it feels like that's what Oda was going for here. It also feels like Oda doesn't understand the distinction between those two groups, but, you know. And while, again, Ivankov has a very positive role in the story, helping Luffy through that arc and the subsequent one, and being an important person in the Revolutionary Army, which we still don't know that much about, but whatever. It's also true that Ivankov is mostly there to be the joke. You know, haha, look at this drag character, haha. In fact, when Ivankov is introduced amongst a whole crew of Newkama people, the only character there who doesn't seem to be presented as purely a joke is Ivankov's right-hand man. I don't know if man is the correct adjective there. Adjective. Jesus Christ. I don't know parts of sentences. It's whatever. It's not the kind of... Anyway, right-hand man may be a misnomer, but this character isn't really shown a lot and doesn't speak, so, like... meh. I actually don't even remember their name, because they're only in that one arc, and they don't have any speaking lines. But anyway, it's kind of a serious, no-nonsense character who has a pretty interesting power to, like, cut things with his giant scissor hands. And if you're being really generous, you could make the reading that Ivankov is supposed to be gender fluid and this right-hand character is supposed to be non-binary, especially with like the visual design of this character. Basically, it's one of those things where it's asymmetrical and one side is all done in white and the other side's all done in black in the manga. In the anime, they go with like orange and white, which is different. And you might assume that this visual design is just because this character has a scissors power and therefore, cuts things down the middle, and so their visual design is split down the middle. But if you're being generous to Oda, you could also infer that this visual design is meant to represent something about their sexuality and the way they view themselves and so forth. But again, this character doesn't have lines, so who knows? I think they talk a little bit, but certainly not enough to get any insight into who they are. And up until now, that was the extent of trans representation in One Piece. Two very important, but still very much gag characters, a whole slew of unnamed background characters who are also treated as a gag, and one potentially interesting non-gag character kind of sitting in their midst with no real characterization to clarify anything. Great job, Oda. However, Yamato could be different. And I say could with skepticism because there are some extenuating circumstances with Yamato that make it more complicated. So, Yamato was born as the daughter of one Thousand Beast Kaido, the main bad guy of this arc. Oh, it also indicates some spicy lore because both Yamato and Kaido have these weird devil horns on their head that may or may not be like genetic, hinting at like a new species that hasn't been explored in One Piece, which kind of happens all the time. There are tons of species in One Piece. Prior to this character being unveiled, people just thought that Kaido having horns was part of his devil fruit or whatever. But now it seems like he's part of a unique species that we haven't seen a lot of, and it creates questions about like who he boinked. But anyway, none of this is important. So Yamato is the child of Kaido, and Kaido is this big bad evil guy who's taking over a country. The current leader of the country is named Kazuki Oden, and in order to protect his people, he bravely sacrifices himself in this really dramatic fashion, reminiscent of an actual story of an actual samurai from a long time back. In the original story, the guy and his son were sentenced to boil in oil for a certain amount of time, and the king agreed that if either of them survived, then they would be let go. So this dude just held his kid above the oil the whole time while he burned alive in soup. Like, it's insane. And obviously in the manga, they had to amp it up, so Kazuki Oden did that for his entire retinue of disciples. Anyway, Yamato saw this, thought, oh my god, this is the most badass dude who has ever lived, I want to be like him, and now sometimes introduces themselves as Kazuki Oden because, why just love your heroes when you could try to be them? At the same time, Kaido and all of his followers refer to Yamato as Kaido's son, or the prince. So here's the thing. It could be that Yamato is the first instance of a female-to-male trans character in the entire One Piece world, and that this is a big step forward in positive representation since Yamato has to join the crew. If Yamato doesn't join the crew, we will all riot. Oda, we are coming for you. Yamato's character design and their overall attitude and the way they view the crew is just too perfect. They would be such a great fit. They have to be included. I'm sorry. Anyway, so it could be a really positive representation of a trans character and a really great new addition to the crew and all kinds of good stuff. Or Oda could completely cop out of it very easily. See, Yamato didn't like Kaido at all and was basically a prisoner. So, being forced to live as the son he never had could be a thing as opposed to, everyone respecting that Yamato wants to be viewed as male. Additionally, Yamato hasn't been in the story for very long and only during this war, and so there hasn't really been any time for conversation about how the character views themselves. They've introduced themselves as Kazuki Oden a few times, but saying I am the hero I look up to is a little different than saying I am actually a guy. In fact, one could easily make the case that claiming to be a guy who was 40 and died when you were 3 is more delusional than anything else. And there are big themes of inherited will in One Piece, so maybe it's supposed to be less literal and more, I carry on the will of Kazuki Oden because who else is going to? But anyway, you look at it, Yamato thinking of themselves as Kazuki Oden and Yamato thinking of themselves as trans aren't necessarily the same thing. And it would be pretty easy for Oda to disconnect those ideas and have Yamato be a regular female character, which also wouldn't be that bad because there aren't enough female characters on the Straw Hat crew, but it would be pretty disappointing given how much of a black mark this kind of stuff has left on the franchise. So as far as what's going to happen, whether or not this will represent a positive step forward for the series, only time will tell. Oda might completely backtrack on this. It's possible that the only reason characters refer to Yamato as he is because Kaido said so, not because Yamato said so, which would suck. But who knows? But I really do think it would be a huge step forward for the industry if this happened, because there are a lot of other authors who have tried to tackle this in some way or another and come up woefully short. Probably the most prominent example we have so far of a positive representation of a trans character is Kaluto from Hunter x Hunter. Now, Togashi had his own weird struggle and journey with this particular issue. For anyone who doesn't know, Togashi made both Hunter x Hunter and Yu Yu Hakusho. And early on in Yu Yu Hakusho, there's this minor battle with a side character, but it's not handled super well. See, the crux of the issue is Yusuke and Kuwabara are on their way to rescue this girl, Yukina. But in order to rescue her, they have to beat up the people who are holding her hostage, right? Cool. So they send in, bodyguards to get rid of him one after another. And one of the bodyguards that comes after them looks like a girl. And so Kuwabara refuses to fight because he doesn't hit women. And of course Yusuke doesn't follow the same code, so Yusuke goes up and fights instead and wins. And if this scene were just there to talk about that dynamic, right, like just that whole weird sexist idea, then that might be fine. But in order to sidestep talking about that, what he does is he makes it so that this character who looks female is actually a guy. And so Yusuke isn't breaking this taboo by fighting this character because the character isn't really a girl, which is not a very good way to look at trans people. However, I think Togashi kind of realized that, and so he wrote in this little back and forth between Yusuke and the random fighter person, and it kind of comes off as well-meaning but not really understanding the issues. There's actually a couple other people who've talked about this scene in particular and how Togashi has changed his writing on these characters over time, but I'll leave that for later. Togashi actually did a small series in between Yu Yu Hakusho and Hunter x Hunter, which is this weird little romance, I guess, about aliens who take over the world. It's kind of weird. There's some gender bending, some alien sci-fi nonsense. It's very exploratory, and I don't really know how to fit it into this video. But there are some really great videos talking about it, so I'll link to one of those. And then he did Hunter x Hunter. And Hunter x Hunter is notable for a couple of reasons. One, the character design is much more up in the air with regards to gender. Basically everyone who sees Kurapika is that's a girl, right? But it's not. Also, basically everyone who sees Melody is damn, that's an ugly little dude. But it's not a dude. And neither of these characters are trans, they're just drawn in a way that doesn't reflect who they are, which is interesting. But somewhat androgynous characters have kind of always been a thing in anime, and it's not necessarily as interesting to talk about as what he ends up doing with Kaluto. Now, Kaluto is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, they aren't really introduced until they become a plot device, which is... There's a little bit of foreshadowing that they exist before that, but it's not much, and it's still like... And also, Kaluto has a special Nen ability that seems to involve being possessed by some sort of demonic spirit, which makes it so that they kind of have like two different identities. And also, some of the characters in Hunter x Hunter don't refer to Kaluto by their correct pronouns, so as a reader, it's kind of hard to see like how much of this is the split personality thing and how much of it is like, you know. Someone, actually Totally Not Mark, recently did a video talking about Hunter x Hunter, and he talked about how he views their family using the wrong pronouns as like showing their animosity or something, which maybe was the intent. But at least when I first watched the series and saw this character and saw the way everyone was referring to them, it came off as more muddying the waters. I wasn't entirely sure if they sometimes said he instead of she by accident, or if, you know, they were saying one of the personalities was a he and the other one was a she, or, you know, like what exactly was going on with that. And of course, the text itself doesn't clarify the confusion that is brought up by the text, so... But broadly speaking, there's a lot of nuance with Kaluto, and the character, at the very least, is definitely trans and is definitely seen as a positive character. And you could very easily do what Mark did and see this misgendering as an offense intentionally perpetrated by the people who refuse to accept who Kaluto is, in which case it's like a really interesting and important look at how people are actually treated with regards to this, so it's cool. However, Kaluto was written into and out of Hunter x Hunter more than a decade ago, and that's the last major positive trans character I can think of in an anime. And while Togashi as a writer has developed enough to have that level of subtlety and nuance and really bring this character to life and make it a character that everyone can connect with and appreciate, and a character who, despite being a literal deus ex machina, is still interesting and people don't hate them, that hasn't really been the case for anyone else. And, you know, I think the fact that One Piece is the best-selling manga of all time, it might have some impact on the industry. And if we can have Yamato as a really good trans character, it might mean something for the industry. It might mean some better representation moving forward. But at the same time, Oda's track record with this is pretty bad, and I don't really expect it to get better all of a sudden. But you never know. We'll see what happens, I guess. So I know I only ended up talking about 2 stories, but this really has been a trend in the industry for a long time, and I haven't really seen it explored a lot recently. In the 80s and 90s, it was really common for the more bizarre, surreal, experimental shows to get into this topic. So if you're interested in seeing some stories that do that, I would recommend checking out things like Angel Sanctuary or Magical Girl Utena. They tackle it in different ways, and whether or not Utena counts as a trans character is... I mean, they probably don't. But maybe? There's a lot of imagery around Utena involving a prince and stuff, even though... Anyway, it's complicated. So I would recommend that you check some of those stories out and enjoy them. And also check out some of the YouTube videos I linked that talk about these topics a little bit more. So, you know. Oh, also, tell me in the comments who your favorite trans character in anime is and why. I think that's interesting. Yamato will probably end up being my favorite if Oda doesn't reverse course on this, because Yamato is bomb. But we'll see. Until then, thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next life. Laters. Hey, thanks for watching that video. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, all that stupid YouTube crap. Also, you can find me on Twitch at the Golden Stalfos, obviously. On Wednesdays, me and my girlfriend stream playthroughs of games she's never played before, and that's a lot of fun. And on other days, I will sometimes randomly do a challenge run or something if I'm feeling like it. You can also follow me on Facebook and Twitter to make extra sure you get video notifications. And I have a Patreon if and only if you have money to burn. But to be fair, if you have money to burn, you should also consider some charities. There are always a few linked in my description, just in case. Oh, and be sure to leave positive comments down below for my girlfriend who volunteered to edit my videos for free because she's awesome. And yeah, thanks for watching.